I'm going to talk about common startup mistakes and how to avoid them. Just that's the old me when I had a beard and different glasses. Now this is me without a beard, and probably about 18 pounds later because I took off my COVID weight. So what I'm going to talk about today is really based on my experience over the last 5 years. So I have extensive experience in medical devices, primarily in diagnostics. For those on my line, I'm a PhD biologist by training. So I was a scientist for a while, did a lot of development, and then ultimately moved into management. I've run both small companies, startup companies, to very large multi-billion-dollar divisions of large companies. And what I'm going to reflect on today is really my experience during that. Plus, in the last 5 years, I've been a business consultant, both in private practice and also for the SBDC. So I've now helped or consulted for probably well over 100 to 150 different companies, some of which have turned out to be quite successful and many of which have unfortunately not been very successful. At the end of this presentation, you'll get a copy of this later. There'll be a series of references that I used to put this deck together. So you can look at both books, blogs, and articles. So you can take a look at those. But so what I'm going to do really is to talk about what I feel are the two most important things that you have to consider if you want to have a chance of having a successful company. So if you go on the web and you read a lot of these papers, a lot of them will show you this exact figure somehow in different forms. You can see the lower left-hand corner where I got this particular image, but I believe this was from a Forbes article originally. But these are the top 20 reasons startup fails, and this was based on a study that was done on 101 startups. And you can see all the various reasons, but the ones that I highlighted in the arrows, so no market need, not really, and all the other things come down to the two main points that I'm going to make in the next slide as the primary reasons why many companies fail. The real reason they ultimately fail is they ultimately run out of cash. So the last, when you see a company that finally says, I give up, it's because they actually have no money. So they were unable to attract enough investment money, or they're not able to attract any investment money. And the rest of these reasons are, I believe, symptoms of the two elements that I'm going to talk about today. And again, this is from my perspective, and it differs a little bit from what you might read. So I think there's three primary root causes for all the symptoms that you saw on the last slide. The first one is not the right management team, and I'll go through that in more detail. The second issue are marketing problems. So I'm going to put those, and then the last is it was the company, the startup was unable to develop the product. So I like to look at those three elements as in terms of risk. The first one being leadership risk, the second one being market risk, and the last one being technical risk. I've spent times at last webinars about technical risk and how to do killer experiments, so I'm not going to spend any time on this today. My general feeling is if you have the right people and they're smart, most technical risk things can be solved. It's a time and money exercise. There are exceptions to that rule, especially when it comes to biopharmaceuticals or pharmaceuticals, where the technical risk could be a lot higher, and you don't actually find out if you have a product or not until you get into phase 2 and ultimately phase 3 clinical trials. But for many of the companies that I've counseled, both medical device and life science companies, but I've also seen it with tech companies, most often they can come up with a product, but it turns out the product doesn't meet the market need, and that's what I'm going to go into in more detail in this deck. And ultimately, the number one issue that I find is that the right management team has not been put into place. So you might have seen this before. Sorry for the poor quality of the image. What's more important, the horse or the jockey? Again, there's an article that says it's not just the horse or the jockey, but in my opinion, the horse represents the product and the jockey represents management. In my feeling, the number one issue that most companies fail is because of leadership or because of poor management or ineffective management. So one of the first things we should be asking ourselves, what do the attributes have to be for a capable CEO and a leadership team? In many cases, the person that starts a company, especially a tech company or the medical device or life science company, is a scientist or engineer who has this, what they believe is a brilliant idea for an unmet market need based on their life experiences, and they decide to form a company. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, but that doesn't necessarily make that person a CEO. And if you think about what a CEO's job is, so the CEO is perhaps the most important part of a company, because when it comes time to raising money, investors, whether they be family, friends, angel investors, or VCs, or even banks, they're going to look long and hard at who the boss is, who the CEO is, because at the end of the day, they're going to make a wager on that person. And whereas what often happens in many of the companies I talk to, it's the engineer or scientist or tech person who really understands the product and the technology, and they spend all their time trying to develop that product. That's not what the job of a CEO is. So these are some of the elements that I think are critically important. I'm going to read them because I want to go into a little bit more detail for each one. The first thing a CEO has to be capable of or have a skill set is they really have to be able to sell a very compelling and inspirational vision. Who do they have to sell? They have to ultimately sell investors, but they also have to sell their employees or even consultants. They got to sell people to join their team. Unknown caller. So sorry for that. I got to shut that thing off. So for a CEO really needs to be a salesperson. By the way, all of us need to be salespeople. We're selling, in a lot of these cases, ideas or visions. And really, the CEO really has to be excellent at this. And if they're not, they have to develop the skills. And if they can't develop the skills or they don't want to develop the skills, they actually have to attract the CEO to help do that. The second thing, they have to develop the strategy. So the strategy is not a product. The strategy is the overall business plan, the overall business development efforts. How are you actually going to ultimately make money? Third thing is, in order to both communicate to investors, but also to communicate to both their staff, whether they hire people or they get consultants, they really need to have the ability to set clear goals, focus, and then ultimately execute. And again, I see many startup companies having a real hard time determining how to focus. They have lots of ideas, especially really brilliant scientists and engineers that come up with lots of innovative ideas, and they want to do everything. And I think we've all found throughout our careers, and if you're students throughout school, it's very difficult to multitask and do everything extremely well. The fourth bullet point is what I call look in the mirror. And it's really, and I'll share some of that in the next few slides, is really to understand your strengths as an individual, as a CEO, as a leader, and what critical gaps you might have. And then these are some of the elements that I think most startup companies fail to recognize. They focus on the technology, on the science, on the engineering, but they missed some of these, and these are just some of the bullets. They don't have the capabilities or understanding of skill sets around finance, around commercial, such as sales and marketing, and that's, to me, the next critical point on how they're going to manufacture this in a cost-effective manner, and how they're going to do business development, whether they're going to sell this to other companies who's going to ultimately sell it to the end user, or they're going to do direct to consumers. The next area is highly tied to the areas above. Is none of us can do this all by ourselves. I don't have the skill sets that I would need to run a company, all the skill sets, nor have I seen anybody else having the full capability. And most startup companies want to develop what I call an advisory group. That could be a formal board of directors or an informal set of advisors. So a strong and capable CEO really needs to bring in advisors and mentors, they're somewhat different, who can help them overcome obstacles, can help them attract investments, understand, have expertise in the industry that they're in, so they can actually introduce them to potential customers. Then the last three I'm going to go to is a recognition that CEOs really have to attract and hire the right people. And hire the right people can be employees, they can be consultants, and they can be paid consultants or consultants that you're just given equity. I see many startup companies go and hire their friends or their colleagues, and they're not given a hard look to see if they're the actual right people to make your company successful. Again, the biggest reason that companies fail is they run out of cash. So having the ability to manage cash, especially early on when cash is really light. But I've also seen companies that have been successful raising millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of dollars. I know of a company, which I won't mention, that literally raised 500, maybe $1 million to $1 billion in cash. They hired hundreds and hundreds of people. And within 3 years, they went through almost all $1 billion, and they ultimately went under without ever being successful coming to market. So having the ability of cash management is important, and the skill set changes depending on whether you're trying to manage thousands of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the last one I think is perhaps the most important for me. Is capable CEOs have to demonstrate that they have accountability. At the end of the day, the CEO is accountable for the success or the failure of the company. And they're accountable to make sure that they have the actual right team in place. So here's just another view of what I see as the CEO, what the role of a leader is. We really have at a startup company two main goals. They have to lead and they have to manage. In leading, they really have to be able to set out the whole vision of the company and really establish the culture of the company. A lot of places really overlook this. A lot of startup companies overlook this. They don't give ample time to think about what their vision is, and actually articulating on paper and in slide decks and in pitch decks a compelling vision is critical to attract investment and is critical to attract talent. That's whether it's advisors or employees or consultants. It's also critical for that CEO to establish the culture of the company, the ethics of the company, how people are going to work. If they don't do a really good job here, if they don't really understand this, especially culture, they might end up attracting the wrong talent who actually doesn't fit into their culture. And I've seen startups where I've had examples where people are brought in, even a CTO, who recognized they had to bring in a CEO because they didn't have that skill set. But the CEOs they brought in ultimately didn't align with the founder, that's the CTO, the culture that was established. And after 6 months, a year and a half, that CEO, they actually had they went separate ways. That's a tremendous loss of time and money. And I think that's a rapid recipe for failure. And then the CEO, of course, because early on the CEO is mostly trying to raise capital. You really have to find a way to manage this overall process. And again, this is just a simple tool where these are all the various places where the leader of the company is really trying to manage the organization. They're not necessarily doing the work. They have people to do the work, but they have to manage the overall operations. So to me, most startup companies fail because the leader doesn't recognize what their job is, what their role is. And again, this I find the case with many startup companies. The CEO is trying to do two jobs, both being the CEO of the company and being the chief technical officer or the person developing the product or the service. And those are actually two distinct roles. So here's what I believe is the minimum requirements for an organizational in any companies. I'm using this in a medical device startup, but quite frankly, it should be any company. These do not have to be full-time people. They can be advisors or consultants, depending on how much cash is on hand. There is the CEO. There should be somebody responsible for developing the product. So I'm calling that the chief technical officer, chief science officer, vice president. Don't get hung up on the title, but somebody to lead product development. This is the second most important person. These two are critical. Is the commercial officer. Ultimately, you're in business to make money if you're a for-profit business. And you actually have to have somebody who actually has the skill set in marketing and in sales. Oftentimes, these are two different people. There's somebody who actually has expertise in sales and a different person that has expertise in marketing. But if it can be found, you'd like to find one person who can do that and figure that out early on because you could save some money. Also, finance is critically important. So again, I think you need whether you call it a CFO or a controller or somebody else, somebody who really understands money and finance and spreadsheets, because ultimately, if you're going to go try and find investment dollars, people are going to want to see a business plan or pro formas, and they want to get deep into the financials. So they really understand, how much money is it going to cost you to develop your product? How much money is it going to cost you to sell your product, to market your product? And it's really a CFO or somebody with a strong finance background, which is critically important. Business development to me is a nice to have. This sometimes is embedded within sales and marketing, but these are people who actually have connections and can ultimately help start the sales process. Again, a lot of tech companies, a lot of medical device companies and life science companies, if you're a startup company, you might not necessarily want to sell direct to your end users. There's 6,200 hospitals in the United States. There's 19,000 nursing and assisted living facilities in the United States. It's hard to get to all those people if you're a startup company. So typically what many medical device and life science companies do is they sell to some of the bigger companies as distribution partners. And you really need somebody with business development expertise to, first of all, get introduced to those partners such as Thermo Fisher, my former company, Danaher. Whether you're going to sell to CVS or Walgreens, you really need to do that. Know how to get into those businesses and those targets, but also how to construct those deals. The last two are critically important, and I see this one I put really at the top of the list with this one and this one. Do never underestimate legal and IP. So legal starts with even how you set your company up correctly to start with, whether it's a limited liability company, an S corporation, a C corporation, your charter, your shareholder agreement. I see many startup companies not thinking about this, and then when they go to raise money, this can be a major issue. And of course, in a lot of the fields that I'm in, a lot of the fields that people on this phone are in, intellectual property is really key. So having a strong intellectual property strategy is critical ultimately to the success of the many companies that we deal with in tech and life science and medical device space. And then if you're in medical device or in a highly regulated industry, such as medical device, you really need to have somebody with regulatory and quality expertise. So in all these cases, this would be my ideal setup. This doesn't necessarily happen right away because these might not be full-time employees, but even if you're just starting out and you have not that much money and you want to get going, you really need to be starting to think about these areas and find people who perhaps can help you in some of those areas. A little plug for the SBDC. The SBDC, such as myself and our other consultants, can actually help in these 4 areas. So we can help counsel. And again, we do that at no charge to you. We do not provide legal help and we do not provide regulatory help, but we have access to both attorneys and regulatory and quality staff who have expertise and do work with us to help startups. The question I often get is, should I have an advisory board? My general answer to that is yes, with a caveat. So I think, again, most people starting out businesses don't understand all aspects of the business. So it's really good to have advisors, whether they be a formal board of advisors or an informal advisory board. It's really a group of people who you can really bounce ideas off of, as opposed to trying to figure it out for yourself. So I suggest startup companies find 2 or 3 advisors originally. Again, the decision to have a board or not to have a board is a significant decision. Typically, when you get investment money in, people want to have board seats. So that's the time and you might want to think about it. Before you actually get significant capital in, you just might want to have an informal set of advisors. But you really want to find advisors that actually fill gaps in your own knowledge. So they actually provide skills that the CEO and the management team lack. Often, and I'll use my example in medical devices, often there's not a lot of expertise in startup companies on how to go to market. You know, who were the key opinion leaders in the area, whether, let's say I'm helping a urology company now. Who are the top urologists in the country? Who are the top academic urologists? Who are the top urology practices? So getting an advisor in from one of those practices sometimes is key and can be very helpful to the management team to make sure they have the right strategy, that they're helping to build the right product, and they can actually introduce them to other urologists. They also might be able to introduce them to possible customers as well, whether that be a distribution company or not. And that's what I call social validation, where you really want to try and get advisors who can actually introduce you to new customers, and potentially they might even be investors, or also introduce you to investors. It's very hard to get money from people who don't know you. So a lot of times I've used advisors to introduce me to people who are knowledgeable in the space. And because they're advising my company, I have a leg up and at least getting some level of credibility with potential investors. And I think the most important part about an advisory board is for the CEO to actually listen to them, to respond to them. They don't have to, at the end of the day, they don't have to follow their advice. But having a strong advisory board, not somebody who just tells you what you want to hear, but tells you what you don't want to hear, helps build accountability within the CEO and the management team. So again, these are just some of the elements of an advisory board. Again, it can be formal, it can be informal. They don't have to have legal obligations. They could have legal obligations, so you can do it informally without a contract. Sometimes it's better to do it on a contract. Whether you pay them in money or you pay them in equity, that's really up to you. They don't necessarily have to have specific responsibilities and goals. Sometimes if you have a formal board of directors, they do, but oftentimes they don't. Again, about compensation, it's up to them. I actually believe that you should compensate them in some way, shape, or form, in that you often get what you pay for. So if they're being compensated, they have and they have equity in your company, they are more motivated to help. But again, that's up to you. Or they may or may not serve on a fixed term. So what I often do with the startup, what I also recommend is get a set of informal advisors, set them up on an annual contract with a renewal period. You can elect whether to pay them or not to pay them, and then you assess how they go. You get to know them over a year-long period. If they turn out to be great, they're just what you need, they're really helping you, you might extend it. You might actually formalize it in some sort of contract with compensation. And if it's not a good match, you can all go your separate ways in a very amicable way, saying, "Oh, I'm going to go in a different direction." So I've done that multiple times. It's worked really well. And if it doesn't work out, you can still separate without causing bad feelings. And if it does work out, you have the beginnings of perhaps a board of directors, or you have somebody who really believes in your company and can really help advance your causes. So again, I kind of went into this one. I look for committed, available partners. I recommend, if you're early on it as a startup, or even if you've raised some significant money, I like to keep it small, 3 to 6. I actually like 5. I like an odd number because it helps break ties. But that's much better than having a large board. And I see sometimes people have 7, 8, 9, 10 advisors, but some of them or most of them aren't very engaged. And it takes a lot of time and energy to manage an advisory board. Again, I mentioned that people with diverse skills and experience, you can see them there. And what's most important is to try and find experts in your industry. So if you're doing software as a service, it would be good to get at least one advisor who has expertise in providing software as a service to your particular industry. I often see, even in SaaS companies, people get SaaS companies and they're doing a SaaS for, let's say, a hospital environment, and they bring in somebody who's done SaaS for some consumer's product in cooking. That's a silly example, but I actually see these, and that person knows nothing about how to sell SaaS in a medical and a highly professional, highly regulated environment. So let's talk about startup approaches. This is still around management, but I'm moving into my next part, which is around marketing. So the top one is what I typically see with most technical startups. An engineer, scientist, professor has a great idea. They immediately reach into their own pocket, reach out to mom and dad, their aunts, their uncles, their friends, grab some money and start developing the product. Quickly, they're going to run out of that cash. Therefore, they try and raise some additional capital, and they end up completing a product. And then they actually have to raise more money, and they have to go to market. And in each of these areas, they're first of all, they're finding it harder and harder to raise capital. And ultimately, what you see is when they actually go to market, they actually find out there's no market for their product. And I'd like to say that I rarely see this, but I actually see this most of the time, where companies have spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars trying to develop a product for which there is no market. So what I see here in this tagline is many startups try tackling problems that are interesting to solve rather than solving a market need. So if this is what you're planning to do, I would strongly advise you not to do this. Most of the people I've talked to, and I'm talking to a lot of people right now, they think they've developed something that's better than sliced bread. I don't like that analogy, but it's commonly used. They think it's the best thing that's ever happened, that everybody's going to run and buy their product. And I'll be honest, I've never seen that happen. Maybe it's happened, you were there, but that rarely happens. Amazon, which all of us know today, started as a bookseller. They sold books online. Netflix some of you probably are too young to know, Netflix came out and said, instead of going to a store to rent a VCR, if anybody knows what a VCR is, or beta, or ultimately a DVD, they decided to do it online. And both those companies struggled mightily early on. A better approach, and the one that I advocate strongly, is once you have an idea, spend a little bit of money, a couple $1,000s, and validate that there's actually a market for your product. If you're able to do that and demonstrate that, you're going to be more likely to raise some capital, and it's going to be much cheaper for you to develop your minimally viable product because you really understand what the customer wants, what the customer need is. And I'll go into more detail about that next slides. But you're not done there. That's an iterative process because this usually takes time, sometimes years to go through this process, and markets change over time. So where you might identify a market need today, a year from now, it might change or it might iterate. And you really have to constantly validate and revalidate that you're developing the right product and you're actually solving a true market need. So the bottom pathway is what I recommend people do. I can't tell you how many companies that I've recommended this and they just choose to ignore it. At some time I'd say I can't help you anymore. And more often than not, those companies fail. And there's been a number of companies I've been very successful counseling. I've counseled one recently. They did this very cheaply. I think he might have spent a couple $1,000s. And that particular individual found that there was no market need for their product. But in his market research, he actually found a different market need. And he pivoted his whole company to that different market need. And by doing so, was successfully able to raise capital and develop his first product. So the whole idea that I'm giving to you is, in order to have a successful company, is fail fast and cheap, is to validate your market need. By spending a little bit of money up front, you can minimize your risk earlier. You can actually help to identify your customer. If we start to have a dialogue, and some of you are starting companies, the first question I typically ask the CEO is, who's your customer? You would be surprised that most people cannot describe their customer in exquisite detail. So I can use hospitals. They say, oh, I'm going to sell to hospitals. I said, what kind of hospital? Academic hospital? A for-profit hospital, a not-for-profit hospital, an inner-city hospital, a rural hospital? What kind of hospital are you going to sell to? Because they all have different buying characteristics, and many of them don't know. It helps you identify and validate unmet customer pain, because that's ultimately what you're trying to solve. Many entrepreneurs think that there's no competition for their product because their product does something unique. There is always competition for your product or for your service. And the general competition is either real companies or it's however that customer is doing that work right now. And most customers are very reluctant to change their methods. Most customers are ultimately conservative. So you really have to do a great job in really identifying their customer pain and then coming up with a product or service which significantly alleviates that pain. I also recommend companies, instead of spending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars developing the perfect product, start by building inexpensive prototypes. One of the techniques that I use in medical devices, I build prototypes out of styrofoam and out of cardboard. and I go and walk, so visual aids, I then go and talk to my customers, whether they be surgeons or physicians or laboratory people, and I show them the concept. And I ask them for feedback. And again, those can evolve over time, so they're getting more and more realistic to the product. But I'm trying to do this fast and inexpensively to get rapid feedback to make sure I have the right features and benefits in my product before I'm going to go to the market. So I actually go through this process, and I recommend going through this process iteratively, multiple times. My average time from my first concept to my product, if I'm going to talk in engineering terms, I go through at least 5 different engineering turns to ultimately get to my final product. It's much less expensive to do that than to spend a lot of money to get to your final product, ultimately to find out that nobody actually wants it because it doesn't solve a customer need, or it might solve a customer need, but it doesn't have all the features and benefits that the customer is looking at to justify the cost of switching. I also recommend early on that you validate other major business model assumptions, and these are some of them. Everybody thinks they're going to beat the competition, that the competition's weak. Competition is not weak. Competition has significant strength. And it's important that when you go out and talk to customers, and you'll hear, if I counsel you, do a lot of voice of customer, that's interviewing customers, and find out what competition they're using and why they selected it. You also want to confirm that what you believe differentiates your product or your company or your service from the competition, the differentiated value proposition, is resonating with the customer. So I've heard many companies say, look, I have a product that's 10 times cheaper than the competition. And that's why a customer is going to buy my product. First and foremost, that's rarely the case. Of course, your competition, if they're really strong, can match your price. But more often than not, price is an important characteristic. It's not the most important characteristic with many customers. You do also want to confirm pricing assumptions. So your financial models are based on assuming that you're going to sell so many units or so many licenses, and you're going to be able to price it at such and such a price point. You should actually try and confirm that through voice of customer work. Ultimately, you're going to confirm that when you go to market. But often people put pricing assumptions that are way too high, that the market's not going to respond to that. Because again, you're going up against competition who can easily match your price or beat your price. And actually, a lot of people end up selling their product for a lot less than what they thought. The fourth one is also critical. This goes to the sales and marketing side. And that's why you really want to have people with sales and marketing expertise. What's the cost and time for acquiring a customer? So this is the acquisition cost that you sometimes hear about. Typically, to close a medical device customer, in my experience, the shortest is about 6 months. I've actually taken up to 36 months to close a customer. So the average range is 6 to 18 months because, again, in medical devices, these are highly regulated industries, and all the customers have to go through extensive validation work before they're actually going to decide to buy your product. The next bullet point is what I call stickiness of a customer. It's really important for you to understand what they're currently using and why. How often does a customer change vendors? These are all their purchasing, and what are the key customer purchasing decisions? So in many areas, and you guys can think about it, and ladies can think about it, the software that you're using. If somebody came to you, let's say you don't like PowerPoint, and you're going to switch to something else. Think about your own buying process when how often you're going to switch to a different software product. And again, really understanding stickiness. I'll give you an example. I was selling developing a product, I still am, in the molecular diagnostic space. I used to sell in the immunoassay space. It's two different technology and diagnostics. In immunoassay, 80% of the customers buy or repurchase their current company's product. It could be an improved product, but they repurchase from the same company 80% of the time. Contracts usually run for 5 or 7 years, so every 5 or 7 years, contracts flip and customers rebuy. This is very common in the auto leasing industry. Most customers release an automobile from the same company they leased the last automobile from. In molecular diagnostics, and for different reasons, it's the opposite. Only 20% of their customers stay with their current vendor. 80% of their customers currently switch to new vendors. And that's primarily because molecular diagnostics is a relatively new market, and not any one competitor has all the products and needs and capabilities that a customer needs. 2 last assumptions. Make sure you validate your key financial assumptions, your cost of goods, your expenses, and your time and cost to complete product development. So I see many companies estimate that they're only going to need $500,000 to finish their development. They're often off that mark by 2, 3, or 4-fold. And they quickly realize within a few months that they're running out of money and they have to go back out and raise more capital. And each time you try and raise more capital, it gets harder and harder until you ultimately get to market. And then the last one, which is probably the most difficult, is once you put a team together, to actually do a self-assessment, look in the mirror and say, do you really have the best team to get your product to market? And if you're the CEO, you have to ask yourself, are you the right CEO, or do you actually have to bring in another leader? I've seen many companies, many of my clients recognize that they were the scientist or engineer. They love that. They recognize they're the CTO, but they don't have the skill sets for a CEO. So they then spend time trying to actually attract and find a CEO to help lead the company. By the way, that's a very hard process to go through, but it was really important that they recognize that they're not going to be the one to be able to take this business to the next level and to attract capital. So again, this is just a simple exercise. You might have done this in various places. It's called a SWOT analysis. So in order to look in the mirror, I recommend companies go through this. Again, this will be in the packet. I'll let you look at this later. Look at your company's strengths, look at your company's weaknesses, look at what opportunities are out there. And then a really big issue, which a lot of companies fail to do, is what are threats? And threats are things that are out in the marketplace, in the economy, that you have no control over. So the biggest threat that most startup companies didn't realize till too late was SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. When COVID-19 hit a little over 1.5 years ago, so 1 year and 4 months ago, so if we go back to February and March of 2020, this caught most startup companies completely off guard, and most of them didn't respond real well until it was too late. They actually were very, very slow to say, wait a minute, the whole market changed, the whole world changed. I'm going to be running into a cash problem really soon. I'm going to have a hard time attracting new capital. People are losing their jobs. So they kept spending money as if there was no tomorrow. And within a few months, they ran out of cash. And because this is the early days of the pandemic, investment money was very hard to come by, and they essentially went out of business. So threats are there. In my industry, in the medical industry, regulatory changes are one of the biggest threats. Reimbursement can change year over year, and that's happened in our industry over and over again, where the product that you're developing had a high reimbursement, and then for different reasons, Medicare and insurance companies slash reimbursement, and all of a sudden your whole business model goes out the window. So people have to be thinking about this in your particular industries. So in summary, before I open up the Q&A, there's multiple reasons that cause startup company failure. The two main things that you can do to minimize that risk is make sure you have the right management team. And that I would advise you, if you're the CEO and hiring again, can be consultants and can be advisors. Don't rush into it. Really make sure you understand your vision, make sure you understand your culture, and hire the right team. If you make a mistake for a hire, it is a very expensive mistake. Not only did you waste a lot of valuable time training and bringing that person up to speed, you're going to then have to do it all over again. So the people underestimate, if I hire somebody for, let's say, $50,000, the true cost of replacing that person is probably double that amount. So if that person turns out to be wrong, you're going to spend $100,000 trying to replace that person. That's my general experience. And then the third bullet point is to validate that there's actually a market for your product or service before spending tens of thousands of dollars of your money or your investors' money. I think it would be tremendously successful if you decide to start a company and within 3 or 4 months you spend a couple $100 or a couple $1,000s to find out there's no market for your product. It gives you a chance to pivot, to figure out something else to do with your career or with your company. That is a big success in my book. Third one is to be brutally honest with your company's weaknesses and address them quickly. Again, I see that is often not the case. And then continuously talk to customers. They're critical for your success. It's not a one-time area. That's something that you should do throughout your product development cycle and well into your market. At the end of the day, customers are the one that give you money. You really need to understand who your customer is, what their behaviors are, and what they want, and recognize that over time, their needs are going to change. And the closer you are to your customers, the more you're going to recognize this early, the more you can get out in front of your competition. And with that, I'll take questions.
All right, if anybody has any questions, feel free to come on video and unmute yourself, and Richard would be happy to answer those.
Either put you all to sleep or I wowed you so much you're just in awe. That's my dry East Coast sarcastic.
Anybody have any questions? All right. No. Okay. Let me see. All right. I have a question. Is how much should I capitalize my business with at the beginning?
So that's a great question. A lot of people don't give serious thought about how much money they need to actually get their product, at least to the first stage, what I'll call a minimally viable product. It's often a lot more than you think it is. It's again, back to the planning up front. I see many companies get started, they have an idea, and they quickly realize that they need $500,000 or $150,000 or $250,000 to actually get it to a significant stage. So my general advice, there's no set number. You should really plan it out to see at what point do I have to take it to the next valuation step. So right now, if you're just starting out, your company is not worth hardly anything at all. You actually have to create something to create value. So typically a prototype is a valuation step. So what's it going to cost you to get to a prototype that you can actually start doing some testing on? And I would advise you to actually come up with that number and then figure out how you're going to raise that kind of capital. I see many startups say, okay, I realize I need $500,000 or I need $1 million, but I'm going to start working on it right now. And it's, generally speaking, my experience, it doesn't work out real well. They go get friends and family. I actually call it the 3 F's, friends, families, and fools. So they get money from friends and family. Make sure if you're going to get it from friends and family, they're really close to you and they really understand it. They're making a really big bet and they can lose all their money. Because I have seen cases where people raise money from their friends and family. Company goes under and their friends become not very good friends anymore. And their family is really pissed off at them. But at the end of the day, you should raise as much money as you can to actually get to your first valuation step, which to me is a prototype.